So, seeking, finding after Christmas. It's a very strange period, isn't it, this period between Christmas and the New Year. And I thought I'd just cover one or two confusions. Some of you have not been living in our society for terribly long, and you may be as confused as some of us who have been living here all our lives as to what exactly goes on. You see, traditionally, Christmas began on December the 25th. The Advent period, which we now know as a period of furious shopping in response to the adverts that have been appearing on our screens for the previous 2 months. Did you know that one estimate is that Bicester Village turns over more money per square foot than anywhere else in the world? You'd always thought living in Bicester was, an exceptional place to be. You are closest to the place where the most money per square foot is taken in the whole world. Well, people, if you'd lived in England 500 years ago, strangely enough, there wouldn't have been those kind of shops or stores, no credit cards and so on. And Advent was actually the season of fasting. Hard to imagine, isn't it, given what happens now? So in Advent period, leading up to Christmas, you didn't eat terribly well. You would probably stick to bread, something very simple. And when it got to Christmas Day, you had the feast, because the feast had now come. You celebrated the birth of Jesus. And as you can tell by looking at me, I'd have celebrated enthusiastically if I'd not been eating properly for the previous month. I still do that anyway, even though I have been eating properly. So then the festival started, and Christmas lasted for how many days? 12. Because you all know the song, which we don't sing in church, the 12 Days of Christmas. And the 12 Days of Christmas was the feast of Christmas. And it went through to Epiphany. And Epiphany was the day when the celebration was that the wise men arrived to celebrate the birth of Jesus. Possibly 2 years after it had happened, we're not quite sure. So they had a very long Advent before they got there. So there are various, it's a bit different these days. And it's one of the reasons why one of the challenges we have when we're planning services at Christmas, lots of the carols that we sing date back many, many years, hundreds of years in some cases. And it means they have this slightly different English, sometimes with these and thous in it, which those of you who come to this country recently must be a bit confused by. There seems to be almost two Englishes. There's one that's got these and thous and the one that's got yous. But it is the same language, it's just changed over the years. And then you have the ones where it talks about the angels coming and announcing goodwill to all men. And the women get really worried as to why God only wants to announce goodwill to men and not women. And we have to wrestle with the fact that in the English language and the translations, when it talked about all human beings, the word that the English commonly used was mankind or men. So we have this whole challenge that all this older stuff seems to think that women don't exist. Women really did exist in ancient England. They were included, it's just they weren't included in the word that was used. So I wanted to, those of you who come and are experiencing Christmas in church, maybe for the first or the second time, Christmas really is for all men and women. Everyone is included. And the language is sometimes up to date and sometimes isn't. Sometimes I have written to the Times newspaper, because whenever they quote the Bible, they still have a habit of quoting it in the authorized version of the Bible, the language of the 16th century and the 17th century. And I try to point out to them this is a translation. They are allowed to quote it in a version that makes sense to the people reading the newspaper. I don't think I impress them very much, but journalists still quote the old version of the Bible when they want to quote it. So those are some Christmas confusions. But this morning I thought, therefore, since we're in that period for us, which is between Christmas and New Year, which for the church for centuries has been the period, part of the celebration of Christmas, we would think about the wise men who came seeking and finding. And the next picture, which I tried to work out if I could get a picture of the night sky that would work on the screen. That is the night sky with the Milky Way showing. Can you vaguely sort of see? That's what's there. So when I tell one of my stories, I come from Birmingham, so I haven't seen the night sky very much because it's usually quite bright. And then I've lived in London, and in Bicester and so on. You don't see the night sky terribly much. But I worked for TIFF and I travelled to South America, and there was one night where we slept in the open under the stars in Paraguay. I think the nearest electric light was probably about 250 miles away. And as the sun went down, the parakeets came and roosted in the grapefruit trees. That's a great line, isn't it? Of course, they lived in Twickenham, and the parakeets used to come and roost in the trees in the house, because they'd been let out after the filming at Shepperton Studios of The African Queen. That's where the parakeets came from in London. And they're spreading. Has anybody had parakeets in Bicester? Yeah, they're spreading. Anyway, I saw them in Paraguay, and there were lots of them. They roosted in a grapefruit tree. And then the night sky came, and I saw the Milky Way in a way I had never seen it before. The sky was actually bright with the light from the stars, and it was like somebody taking a paintbrush and painted it across the sky. And it was a joy to see, and I do remember that very well. And it was not unlike that picture when you see that picture properly. And it's interesting to recognize that the story of the wise men, the three kings, which of course they're never called in the Bible, the wise men, they were people who studied the heavens. They looked at the stars. They were convinced that God revealed himself, or there'd be messages found from following the stars. And one of the messages we know from the stars, many scientists studied it because they knew they'd been created by God and they would work properly. They knew that if we went round that 24 hours, we'd keep going round every 24 hours. In that sense, they revealed God to scientists, because scientists trusted that the night sky would be the same and the planets would be in the right place at the right time. And these magi, as they're sometimes called, these people, these wise men, they studied the stars. They looked for signs in the sky. Now, nowadays, in churches, if somebody came in and said they're interested in astrology, we'd all take one step back and say, "You're very nice to see you. You're very welcome here." And we probably wouldn't want to leave the children anywhere near them because, astrologers, that's a little bit dodgy. These were people who searched the night sky and wanted to know the truth. And one of the things I think is interesting about this is that one of the things the Bible tells us is that the change that came at Christmas was a cosmic change. We concentrate on a baby born in a manger. We concentrate quite rightly on the fact that Jesus was born so that we could become part of his family, as we've remembered in the communion service. But the Bible also recognizes there was some significant change went on in the whole of the universe. It was written in the stars. Here's the verse on the screen. God was pleased, gets his eyes a bit closer, through him to reconcile to himself all things, whether things on earth or things in heaven, by making peace through his blood shed on the cross. Part of the big picture, part of the big plan that God had and has for the world is that the death of Jesus, the birth of Jesus and the death and his resurrection was part of his plan to put everything right that had gone wrong. When sin first entered into the world, the whole of the universe was affected by it. And Jesus' coming was intended and was part of the plan to put all of that right. There was a cosmic change. It was written in the stars. It's worth remembering that as we get to Christmas, we open our presents, and I don't know whether you have nativity sets at home and you look at them, that intimate scene in a place of no concern, outside the inn that had no room, in the place where the animals were, that was the place where the whole history of the universe was changed, because a baby had been born who would die and would rise again from the dead. So the Christmas story has a cosmic element to it. And these wise men looked in the stars to see the signs, and they saw the sign. They saw a star, and they decided to follow it. They had to meet the king. Now, I say this most years when I get to speak about this, that the Bible doesn't say whether there were three, doesn't call them kings, just says wise men from the east. We think there were three because they brought three presents. I mean, imagine if there'd been five and only three of them had presents. I mean, it would have been really awful, wouldn't it? Two of them standing back. And knowing the service stations weren't open, and if they were, all they could get was a bag of charcoal, it wouldn't have worked, you see. But so we think there were three because there were three gifts. And they brought them because they were coming to meet the king. And they made the interesting decision to go and look for the king where the king lived, in the palace. Fairly obvious thing to do, you'd think. And they learnt something very important that we learn, that where you find God is not always where you expect to find him. You did very well when that reading came up, not to boo when Herod said, tell me where he's going to be. He is the sort of pantomime villain, isn't he, in the story? And we can smile about it now. It was no laughing matter in Bethlehem. I don't know about you, I was watching the news from Bethlehem just yesterday on the television. A giant wall built to keep people in or out. It's been a place where there's been difficulty over the years. 2,000 years ago, it was the sound of parents crying because children had been killed. Sadly, there's still a place where parents cry. And that was the world that they came to. But they came to meet the king. And the first thing I think we can simply learn from them is that they had faith. I mean, how much faith do you have to set out on a journey following a star? You have to believe, don't you? Interestingly, they probably followed almost exactly the same route that a certain person called Abraham had followed a couple of thousand years earlier. The father of the Jewish people had probably come the same route. Susan and I went to Petra many years ago, and we discovered that Petra was on that route, and it was the main place where frankincense was sold. Maybe they did pick up their presents on the way from the service stations, who knows? But they arrived with the presents for a king, the gold for a king, the frankincense for a priest, and the myrrh as a herb that's used for death. Interesting present to give to a baby. They had faith to understand what was going on here. They had something else as well. They had perseverance. They kept going. I don't know whether you've ever been on a long journey. Some of you may well be ramblers. Anybody here is a rambler? Anybody go for long walks? Oh, I'm so good to feel at home because I can't put my hand up, so that's really good. We've got no ramblers. I suppose the ramblers might well be rambling at the moment because people go, did you grow up being made to go out for a walk on Boxing Day? Yeah. Did any of you go out for a walk on Boxing Day this year? Peter, you come back from the east and you went out for a walk in the damp and the drizzle, and you thought, this is what home's like. They had perseverance. They kept going. It takes perseverance to keep going on a long journey, especially when you're not quite sure where you're going and what to expect when you get there. And what happened when they got there? They worshipped. And I don't think you have to be a genius to see what lessons I might just suggest that we can learn from these wise men. Because as we come to this period, which for us is sometimes called, in that glorious word, Twixmas, between Christmas and the New Year, we're looking ahead. And what we need for the 2025 is fairly straightforward, isn't it? We need faith. We need faith to keep going. We need faith that the person who came in at Christmas, the baby that was born and who grew up and died and rose again from the dead, who we've met with in a simple meal this morning, we have faith that that person is with us and will be with us by his Spirit as we move into a new year. And we also then are reminded that we need to have perseverance. There are days when following Jesus is easier than others. Or to put it another way, there are days when it's harder than others. And some of you have gone through a year where you've had to really persevere to keep going. Your faith has been tested. There's been things happen to you, and you've asked God why it's happened. Why have these things happened? And sometimes we need perseverance simply because we do live in a place where more money changes hands per square foot than anywhere else in the world. And there's things that can drag us away from our attempts to follow Jesus. And we need to persevere. It's an interesting word, isn't it? Not one we hear of very much. Keep going. Keep on keeping on. That's part of what the message of the wise men is to us today. And then we worship. They came and they worshipped. There's lots of places in history I'd like to have been. It'd been interesting to have been there, wouldn't it? When we've no idea how many were in their sort of entourage. We don't really know even whether there were camels or not. Who knows? But we know there was a strange moment when these people who travelled hundreds of miles came to see a baby, and they knelt down and worshipped. And people looking on may have wondered what on earth was going on. Herod certainly wondered what on earth was going on. And part of our purpose in the world is to worship. And as we go into 2025, then we're called to be people who worship God. And sometimes we realize that means turning up on a Sunday and being part of the service. It does mean that. It's great to see those who come week by week. And it's lovely to see people coming from all different parts of the world. And it's great to see people of different ages coming, because that reflects the nature of God's love for everybody. It's inclusive. One of the things that we're reminded of when the wise men come, that there are outsiders coming to worship. The shepherds came. We heard from Steve about the shepherds being those who were so low in society that their word was not even taken in a court of law. They weren't regarded as trustworthy, yet they were the first to see the baby Jesus and be told about it. And the wise men came from outside a Jewish society that was very concerned about strangers and foreigners. And yet there, as they gather around the manger, in our nativity sets at home, if you've got them, there they all are, because the Christmas story is a reminder that God welcomes people regardless of whether they're rich or poor, regardless of where they come from, regardless of whether they were born to a posh family or whether they weren't. Because the only way we can become part of the family of God is by recognizing we all come through the door the same, as an individual who needs to trust God for our futures. And so our worship comes as we worship together, and our worship comes as we live our lives for Jesus. We talked about that in the communion service. One of the things that people misunderstand sometimes about the church is that they think that the church is about worship when we come to a worship service. And we do worship when we come, and together we concentrate and think about God. But the Bible's very clear. Our worship continues when we go out through the door, when we meet people, when we greet people. As we go about our daily lives, we're called to be people who worship God in the way that we live. Back to those words in the communion about the hands and the feet and the arms and I can't remember all the things, eyes and ears. That's worship. So as we look forward to 2025, if you are looking forward to it, as you approach it, even if you're not looking forward to it, what we'll need is faith, perseverance to keep going, and the intention and the aim to worship God with our lives, day by day, week by week, month by month. And that's how we'll get to meet the King. And the amazing offer of Christmas is that we all have the opportunity to meet the King day by day. When we spend time in prayer, when we read our Bibles, as we live our lives, each day is a day to meet the King. And we're going to have a song.